Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm Ukrainian Canadian. Today is December 6th, 2024, and let's get to the news and map updates happening in Ukraine, Russia, and we'll talk a little bit about Syria because there's some interesting updates as well with Syria, and things are moving very fast there. And actually, I wanted to cover a little bit of what's going on there, especially with what happened in the last few days. So let's first talk about the map in Ukraine and the updates. You guys already know that I usually always start with Pokrovsk, the southern Ukraine front around Pokrovsk, because that's where really the Russians are putting the maximum amount of pressure for the last few months. Ever since they've captured Avdiivka, they've continued on with relentless pressure in this entire direction here. And unfortunately, Ukraine hasn't found yet a solution to really stop the constant waves of attacks that the Russians have been creating throughout this entire front line, due mainly to the fact that they were able to recruit and mobilize over 30 to 35,000 men per month. So that allows them to really replenish these reserves, but not enough to build up a sizable force. So they're constantly throwing these soldiers, specifically in Donetsk, Donbass, but they're also losing a similar amount of men per month, which is really terrible and catastrophic. If it was a situation that would apply in a Western military, imagine if the US was losing 30,000 troops per month. But for Russia, that's a completely normal scenario, or casualties, I should say, not losing, but casualties. So that includes missing in action, wounded, and also dead soldiers. So if we zoom in into the Pokrovsk direction, you guys can see that many pockets start really forming. And as I've said, this entire row of settlements below Kurakhove will be taken by the Russians without a doubt. You can see that slowly they're capturing one village after another, and it's just a matter of time before they close out this pocket. Kurakhove, as you guys can see, is about 50% occupied by the Russians. The Ukrainians are holding on to the last remainder, the western district of Kurakhove. But again, I'm anticipating that the Ukrainians in the next few weeks will pull out. They have been performing very well despite all the pressures by the Russians. Again, I've said that I was anticipating Kurakhove to be taken by the Russians by the end of November, and the Ukrainians are still holding it in early December. But you know, you guys can see that there's just way too much pressure from all different directions in the center of Kurakhove, below Kurakhove, in the north around the reservoir, for the Ukrainians to be able to hold on for very long here. So the Russians will do everything possible to realign this entire front line and then continue on putting more pressure towards Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, and all the other villages and cities on this main road that connects very key, important Ukrainian cities, including one that we haven't been talking about much, but Konstantinivka. And then you have, of course, Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. So that's always been the goal for the Russians, is really pushing the Ukrainians out of the administrative borders of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. So for now, the Russians are really pushing very slowly. They're having catastrophic losses. And one thing I want to update you guys on, especially in this direction, the Ukrainians were able to have a successful I need to highlight a small counteroffensive around the area of Novy Komar. You guys can see that a few days ago, the Russians pushed through, and Velika Novosilka was under direct threat, almost being encircled by the Russians. And the Ukrainians did a successful counteroffensive to retake this settlement because it's a key supply road that passes through to supply the Ukrainian forces in Velika Novosilka. But you can see that even around Velika Novosilka, the Russians are putting even more pressure, thanks to also capturing Vuhledar a few weeks ago around this direction. So now that allowed them to really put even more pressure closer to Zaporizhia Oblast and kind of the edge of Donetsk Oblast. So there's a tremendous amount of pressure by the Russians. But one thing I want to mention is, of course, winter is almost here. In the next week, I checked the weather forecast in Pokrovsk. There's going to be rain and snow. So that means that the Russians will certainly not be as mobile anymore. Ukrainian soldiers actually noticed, that's based on Ukrainian soldiers on Telegram and their testimonials, mentioning that they've noticed that the Russians have reverted back to using heavy armored vehicles in their attacks, because scooters, the Chinese death crosses, the ATVs, etc., the dirt bikes are not working anymore in this type of frigid cold weather, these types of cold weather conditions. So the Russians are going back into these old heavy vehicles, which will make them far more detectable and easier to destroy by the Ukrainian either artillery or FPV drone operators. So I think that we will be seeing a slowdown of Russian gains, but that doesn't mean that the Russians will ease off the pedal and they will completely stop their offensive. We understand that they're still going to continue in pushing because they have the momentum right now. But the Ukrainians are still holding the line, more or less. We understand the key cities have not been taken by the Russians. That includes Pokrovsk and Myrnograd and Velika Novosilka. But there's definitely a lot of danger and risks in the next few weeks. And as well, Kurakhove, as you guys can see, even though the Ukrainian forces control about 50%, maybe a little bit less, 40% of the city, it appears evident that the Russians will be able to take control over Kurakhove over the next few weeks, perhaps by the end of this year. But we will see how that develops as well. So it is imperative that you guys continue supporting the Ukrainian forces, and especially the drone program. FPV drones have played a key role in supporting the Ukrainians and the defense of Donbass, and so we need to continue helping the Ukrainian forces. So please donate. I have a link below towards the famous Rusoris drone fund, which helps give about 200 to 400 drones per day to the Ukrainian military. So please, if you have some extra dollars you want to donate, please donate to the Rusoris drone fund in the description below. So that's kind of a little update for the Pokrovsk, Velika Novosilka front. With regards to Chasiv Yar and Toretsk, not many changes, as you guys can see. The battles are more or less the same in the center of Toretsk. So the Russians are not having a lot of success here in gaining ground. And of course, because it's an urban city and the fighting is going in an urban area, the Russians do very bad in urban combat. So we're seeing their struggle here is evident in Toretsk. And the same with Chasiv Yar, which Ukraine has been holding for several months now, since people were saying and several experts were saying that Chasiv Yar would fall within a matter of months when Russia really started this new offensive back in the spring of this year. Additionally, the other update I want to give is the Ukrainians were able to drive out the Russian kind of bridgehead that they created around Dvorichna. As you guys can see, the Ukrainians conducted a counteroffensive here and drove out the Russians from the Oskil River. You can see here that it's not very wide in this sector, because the Oskil River, if you go more lower, you can see that it becomes far bigger around Kupiansk in the south. But in northern Kupiansk, it's a very shallow river, which is a lot easier to cross. So the Russians were hoping that they would be successful here, create a bridgehead, and then put a lot of pressure around Dvorichna. But thankfully, the Ukrainians were able to counterattack and drive out the Russians from this direction. So that's the update for Luhansk and northern Kharkiv region. And last but not least, I want to talk about Kursk. Just a quick update here. The Russians are continuing with their offensive here, trying to retake the territory back, but they're failing miserably, and they have catastrophic losses in this direction. I've been seeing just a lot more videos by the Ukrainian armed forces, the FPV videos of the destruction of Russian armored convoys, or just the logistics, them driving vans or Ladas to try to resupply its forces. And the Ukrainians are successfully targeting these logistical routes and destroying one by one these Russian loaf vans or small load trucks that they're driving to resupply their forces. So overall, you can see that Ukraine still maintains a good position around Kursk. Yes, Ukraine has lost a considerable amount of territory since August, about 200 to 400 square kilometers since Russia started their offensive, but they're making the Russians pay for it. And it's about creating a battlefield area that is advantageous for Ukraine and less about what territory Ukraine controls in Russia, because we understand that it's simply not realistic to believe that somehow Ukraine would have been able to push all the way up to Kursk, Lvov, take over control of the nuclear power plant. We understand that the Ukrainian logistics would have been really stretched. It would have been very difficult to defend. And the Russians, knowing that they have just mass quantity, they would have easily, after a few weeks of regrouping, would have been able to drive out the Ukrainians and make them a lot weaker. So Ukraine really concentrated its presence in a specific sector and is now making the Russians pay for them trying to regain all this territory back. And truly, this has been, I think, a very successful operation by the Ukrainians. And they're able to convert, according to the Ukraine military, the ratio of losses is 7-1. So basically, the Russians are losing 7 soldiers to every 1 Ukrainian soldier. So that's a pretty good ratio, in my opinion. So that's the update pretty much for the situation in Ukraine. The map changes. And the good news again that is that Ukraine is holding on. The weather is becoming very cold, and the Russians are struggling. And I can see that with kind of a reduction of territorial gains as we're heading now into the end of December. More rain, more snow, cold weather, and the Russians have to resort to very old, heavy armored vehicles, which are very easy to detect for the Ukrainians, and that slows down Russian gains, especially in Donbass right now, and especially as well in Kursk. So now let's go back to the news updates, and I want to talk about Syria. And I kind of said I lied last week that I wouldn't really cover it because I didn't think that it would be such a colossal failure for Assad. I think that more or less, yes, the Syrian rebels would have some success, but then they would be stopped. But what I'm seeing right now, guys, is that this is a complete collapse of the Assad regime. And it could be very likely that within the next few weeks, by the end of this year, Assad could be toppled. Now, it's not a certainty, but with the way things have been ongoing for the last few days, it seems like it's heading that direction. Because this brief map shows you just how everybody has moved against Assad. The rebels in western Syria, the SDF, YPG, in northeastern Syria, rebels in kind of south of Syria as well have moved in against the Assad regime, and everything is collapsing. Since I made my last update, now the Syrian rebels are controlling Hama, and they're on their way of controlling Homs. These are two key crucial cities for the Assad regime because it connects the road from Damascus through Homs, connects then to Tartus and Latakia, which is a Assad regime stronghold. This is the most pro-Assad area in Syria. So they're going to be essentially cut off from the capital of Damascus if the rebels are successful in taking Homs and its suburbs, which seems to be the case right now. And why I'm saying that is because everywhere where the rebels are pushing, the Syrian regime army, the Syrian Arab army, is just leaving and not even putting up a fight. So this shows me that there is a clear lack of morale, of motivation. And I think everybody seems to be giving up on Assad right now. Nobody believes in his power. He had so many years to consolidate power, to make amends with the rebels, try to find a solution out of it. He continued to be the same, and he's paying the price for his inaction in the last 4 to 5 years of relative political stability within Syria, right? Assad controlled like 80-75% of Syria, and now you can see how much he controls now, and he's on his way to lose even more in the next few weeks. And what is good news is that, of course, Russia supports the Assad regime. And interesting comment by Russia today. Apparently, according to sources, Putin informed Assad that any intervention will be very limited, as it has other priorities at this time. Sky News Arabia reports. I wonder what those priorities are for Russia. But essentially, this is what I told you guys last week, that aside from a few military airstrikes and very limited intervention, Putin is not going to save Assad at this stage. He's not going to give up Ukraine for Syria, right? Ukraine is his crown jewel project, and he's going to do everything possible to maintain his momentum in Ukraine. And we've seen that with the Kursk operation, where Putin was unwilling to transfer an immense amount of forces to retake Kursk. So Syria is even an even smaller priority for Putin at this stage. So this is good news for us because, of course, Russia's been weakened. Its geopolitical presence is also being weakened thanks to this rebel Turkey-backed offensive against the Assad regime. And they've lost so many assets already. Several air defense systems that were taken by the rebels that were coming from Russia. Additionally, military airfields with Russian jet fighters being taken by the rebels. Like, there's a lot of things developing where Russia invested so many billions of dollars in Syria and is now losing this in a matter of a few days. So this is very good news, but let's not lie to ourselves like this is somehow going to impact the situation in Ukraine. It will not, but Russia's image of Russia strong, when Russia enters any war, it wins, forget about it. And, the fact that Russia's uninterested in helping Syria shows how committed of an ally and partner Russia truly is. And one last thing I want to mention here is Turkey really, and this is something I haven't talked about, but they've pulled a brilliant geopolitical move, in my opinion. Erdogan and Turkey is the main reason why this has worked out. They've seen an opportunity with Iran, Hezbollah being weakened by Israel. You have Russia, of course, tangled up in Ukraine. you have so many players right now that have been weakened that Turkey saw an opportunity to pull a brilliant geopolitical move and weakening Assad, maybe even toppling him, and leveraging this position in future negotiations. Whatever negotiations may be in the future, Turkey is going to have this big chip in their pockets, and they can use it. So this, we need to give credit to the Turkish government. They pulled out a really good move here, because without their involvement, this, I think, would not have been as successful as it is. And this has really caught everybody by surprise, including me. Like, the reason being is that it took years for the Assad regime, with the help of Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia, to retake Aleppo, Hama, Homs, all the fighting around Palmyra and fighting against ISIS in the south of Damascus and Daraa. Like, this took them years to regain. And in a matter of days, they just lost all of these major multi-million, I was about to say multi-million-dollar, but cities of over 1 million people plus. Like, this is a huge, huge collapse. So it's a very interesting time we're living in, that's for sure. And last but not least, guys, I want to talk about a big, big announcement by Zelensky and the Ukraine military today. New Ukrainian cruise missiles. Call it how you want. Could be long-range, supersonic Ukrainian, not supersonic, but super fast Ukrainian long-range drones, cruise missiles. It doesn't matter. What is important here is that this new weapon that Ukraine has built, it's called Peklo, which is hell in Ukrainian, which is a very appropriate name for what's going to happen soon in Russia, is a brand new, in my opinion, cruise missile that flies over 700 kilometers an hour and has a range of over 700 kilometers. And it seems to have the same payload of Storm Shadow or Scalp. So this is very interesting. And not only that, but Ukraine has started mass producing them as well. In this showroom alone that was presented by Zelensky today, it appears that they had already about 60 units. And of course, Zelensky mentioned that Ukraine is planning on increasing the production of these Peklo cruise missiles. So who knows, maybe they could be producing 100, maybe a little bit less than 100 per month. This would be a really big game changer for Ukraine, in the sense that, the flight range of 700 kilometers gives Ukraine the chance to be also hitting Moscow at will. And of course, we need to understand that Ukraine is not going to be hitting civilian targets like Russia does when they attack Kiev, but key military targets in Moscow. Moscow is the capital of Russia, and there's a lot of military administrative buildings present there that Ukraine can easily target. You launch maybe a dozen of these Peklos, and even if 2 or 3 reach their intended target, that can still do a lot of damage against all these administrative secret service buildings, military buildings, factories that the Putin regime has concentrated in the elite capital of Moscow. So this is really important, and this is also going to remind the Russian elites that the war isn't that far away from them and that Ukraine has new capabilities. And I have mentioned this multiple times, guys, but what was really important for Ukraine, we know that, and I've complained myself a lot about, the West is not providing Ukraine the long-range capabilities, no Atacams, no Taurus, no Storm Shadows for many years, and we can complain, but Ukraine had to understand that it had to become self-reliant. And I'm very happy to see that Ukraine is now developing long-range drones, ammunition, artillery systems, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, other types of missiles. Like, Ukraine is really trying hard to be self-reliant, because that's what, in this type of situation, Ukraine gets to decide when and how it can use these weapons, rather than being told, no, you can't strike this area, and actually don't go further than 250 kilometers. Like, Ukraine cannot be imposed these limitations. So by making its own weapons, Ukraine can decide. And that's really important. And how it wants to use it, how Ukraine wants to use them as well. That's very important. So I'm hoping with this announcement that in early 2025, we're going to see all these weapons in action. We've talked about the Ukrainian Grim 2 ballistic, the Palyanitsa long-range drone, also this new one, Peklo. Ukraine has a lot of new toys in its arsenal, and hopefully it can put them to great use in early 2025 to really send a big statement, because we know that early 2025 is going to be very important with Trump coming into office, and Ukraine needs to create an image of strength. And I think that these weapons are going to provide exactly that. And there's going to be a lot of back and forth between Trump and NATO, other NATO countries, and discussion of ceasefires and this and that. You know, it's Minsk 1, Minsk 2, Minsk 3, right? Like trying to impose different sort of ends of the war to Ukraine. So it's really important that Ukraine tries to do its best to really showcase that it's still strong and is capable of continuing its defense. So what Ukraine really needs to do as well on top of this is really trying to convince the Trump administration, put as much pressure on, you know, why you should be supporting Ukraine and not Russia. Why should you continue supporting the Ukraine military and, you know, not rely on a quick ceasefire? And I think that Ukraine really needs to drop this ethical, morally right argument from its narratives, you know, because we know that indeed that is true. Helping Ukraine is just morally right. Ukraine is fighting for the good side right now. But it's just not working on the Trump administration. They don't see it that way. They don't care that, oh, well, you know, the Ukrainian people are so grateful. They're compassionate people. They're good people. That's why we should be supporting them. That's true, but that's not how Trump sees it in his administration. They see it, as I've explained that many times in the past, that they see it as what's in it for me. And that's what's important, that Ukraine presents these types of arguments and reasons to the Trump administration that, you know, explain the consequences of giving up on Ukraine and what it would mean for your China project, for you going against Iran, or also the economic gains that the Trump administration can have from allowing Ukraine to win this and giving them the weapons and the assistance that Ukraine requires, the resource gains that the United States can get from this, and just how it can be seen as a political win for Trump, right? Of him presenting himself as this great deal maker, you know, one of the strongest presidents that came into office and, you know, had victory with the Ukrainians. Like that can be a very strong win for Trump as well, politically speaking, and also in history. So I think that's it's really important that Zelensky and his administration really push with that agenda, with these types of narratives, not only to Trump, but also NATO and other partners of Ukraine, rather than saying, oh, well, you know, Ukrainian people are suffering and it's really important that you continue helping them. That has less traction nowadays, unfortunately, whereas it had a lot of traction at the beginning of the war. Remember the compassion from the entire world towards Ukraine. And now people forgot about how important it is to support Ukraine because it's just morally right, unfortunately. So we'll talk about business with the Americans, and I think that's going to work. And I think that's exactly why Zelensky is flying tomorrow, one last note, to Paris for the reopening of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And he's going to meet with Trump, and I'm sure he's going to have these discussions and tell Trump that it's in your interest to support Ukraine. And I think that Trump is going to make the right decision. Perhaps not in the beginning, but he's going to realize that support Ukraine is going to be key for, you know, strengthening his name in the history. Thank you so much for your support, guys. I hope you enjoyed my update. Let me know in the comment section what you think about this new Ukrainian cruise missile, the Peklo cruise missile, about the situation in Syria, and also Zelensky meeting with Trump tomorrow. Do you think it's going to be successful or not? I'm eager to hear your comments, and thank you so much. Slava Ukraini!